Okay, so let's talk quickly about components and instances. This is very similar to in programming where you have like a class and then you have an instance of that class, or whatever it's called in your favorite programming language. And essentially, it's a really good way to create reusable components that can power an entire user interface, but be controlled from one central place. So let's go ahead and create a component. Let's say that we're doing like an app store on your iOS phone, assuming you have an iOS phone. Let's say that you go into App Store, you will see a bunch of cards being laid out like this, and each card will have some text on it saying like, download this app, and some text on here, and some text on here. Okay, you'll have to use some imagination here, but imagine this is like a mobile app with these cards. You could just make these separate layers and work on them individually, but of course that gets quite annoying when you realize, oh, actually I want this to be bolder and have a little less character spacing. You tweak the design and suddenly these guys are out of sync. And this quickly gets super annoying and it's really not a viable option for designing. And that's where components come into play. So what we can do is we can create a single one of these, we can select it and choose create component. And when you do that, it gets this purple color around it and this little icon, meaning it's a component. And we can now call this perhaps card. And so a component is a frame, so it has its own coordinate system, which is nice. So you can like put this either at like 0, 0, but I'm going to put this as maybe 32, 32. And we can put a little text description here for this app. Let's put some lorem ipsum in there. We set the width of this guy to something else. Maybe, why can't I edit the width? Sometimes I don't understand Figma as well. So you never have to feel bad when Figma is acting weird. Alrighty, so we give it a little text description like that. We reduce the line height. We can give it a little opacity. Okay, so that is looking quite nice. And let's just give the entire component a background as well. So we give it a fill property and we can give the component a radius like that. All right, I'm just burning through this so you get the sense of what a component is. Okay, so now let's actually design the app. And so I'm going to draw a new frame here, which is our app. I'm going to set the width to 500 pixels and the height to 800. And now I want to use this component. And so there are a few ways you can start using your component. It's probably going to be available here under the Assets panel. So you can see it here. You can drag it into your app. And now you have an instance of it here. What I typically do is I just press the Option key on my keyboard and I drag the component. And that also creates an instance. And that's just the fastest way I find. But both ways are very good. Just drag it in here and now you have an instance. And if you copy this, copy paste, you're copying the instance. So you can create 3 instances simply by copying and pasting these guys. So now we have 3 instances of this card. And we can just clean up the layout a little bit using the tidy up function. We can give it a good spacing of like 24 pixels. And we can align them something like that. And let's give this frame a little background so we can actually see the cards on here. All right, that looks okay. Let's make this a little bit bigger. We can center these cards. Okay, lovely. So now we have 3 instances of this component in here. And so if we go to the component and make a change, that's going to trickle down instantly to all of these guys. So as I type here, you can see that the instances change. And if I change something like the color, that will propagate instantly as well. And so, for instance, it might look good to have a little shadow behind each card. So we select this component, choose effects, add a little shadow, tweak the properties, something like that. And now that has propagated to all these instances. An instance also has overrides. So you can't override everything, which kind of makes sense because at some point you're kind of like no longer connected to the original component. But you can change content of the text, for instance. So you can say download fruit ninja, And this might be sleep timer, and this might be rerun mobile. Alrighty. So now you've overridden the text values, but you're still connected to this component. So if we change the text color here, that propagates, but your override still remains. So that's quite nice. However, if you were to go in here, you can change the text color inside this instance, but that kind of disconnects you from the text color up here. So if you change this to red color, it's going to be pushed down to the ones that haven't overridden it. But this one, since it overrode that change, you're going to sort of be off that color upgrade path, so to speak. So this is forever overridden now, and there isn't really a good way of sort of getting rid of that override. If you get rid of the color, you actually set it to no fill, which is an override in itself. So if you ever you start to override things and then you regret your decisions and you're like, oh no, I just want to go back to the default. What you can do is you can right click on the instance and say reset all changes. And so this is sort of the nuclear option where you've overridden a little too much and you just want to go back to whatever the component provided. Then you reset all changes here. And now you're back here and you might have to say download fruit ninja again. So that's components and instances. It's really a very powerful system. Sometimes when you're working with a complex design, you might find that you have a billion components and instances and you get really detached from this is the instance, but where is the component? It might be on a different page. It might be 100 pixels away. And so what you can always do when you have an instance like this is that you can click it and find main component and go to main component. And that will teleport you to the main component where you can make a little tweak or something. And down here you have return to instance, and that will teleport you back to this instance. So let's say that I'm in the middle of a design here and I'm using this instance of the component and I realize, the parent component should actually have a little notification badge here. Then I can say main component, go to main component. I can add that little notification badge like so. And then I can press return to instance, and I'm going to find that on my instance as well. And it's going to be available on every instance. That's a terrible notification design, but anyways, that's how you can sort of teleport back and forth between instances and the main component. There's one final thing that you might want to be aware of, and that is something called variance. And variance is when you have two components that sort of belong to the same set. So a good example of this, let's remove these guys, is a toggle component. So I'll create a new frame like this, and we'll draw up, let's make a big toggle component. So 200 pixels wide and 80 pixels tall. And so I'm going to draw a rectangle here for the toggle track, as it's sometimes called, like that. And then we're going to have the toggle handle like this. Bear with me. Okie dokie. So I click it, I create a component, and we call this toggle. And so let's say that I'm working on a design here and I want to use a toggle. So I can drag that in, create some instances of the toggle. That is all well. And I could create a separate component here called toggle on, where this handle lives up here, and maybe it's green because it's enabled now. And I could create a component here and drag that in. But the annoying thing is if you want to quickly switch between these, they are entirely different components. And so it's kind of a disjointed experience. Okay, I have to remove this, I have to find the other one and drag that in instead. And so this is where variants come into play. And variants are just you take two components and you give them a name. And this is also kind of similar to rerun. You can name them slash and then add the variation. So I'm going to call this toggle on and toggle off. Actually, this is the on and this is the off. Alrighty, so now we have two components that are very similar, but they are still disjointed, separate components. But because we named them like this, we can just select them and combine as variants. And Figma understands the naming here and says oh, it looks like you're trying to create a family of components. And so you can choose combine as variants. And you get this little dashed line around them. And now they are variants. And so what's cool about that is that let's drag this component in here and create an instance. And now you have a toggle component here, but it has a property. And you can toggle that, and now you're toggling in between these two components inside that variant. So this is the entire variant, which contains two different components. And so if we select that variant, we can actually rename this property and call it instead on, or enabled, maybe is better, enabled. And now we can sort of have this variant that has a property instead, which is enabled. And that's just kind of a way to create a user interface in your Figma file, where like instead of you having to manually go find the right component, you can just create a little UI where toggling different values does different things and chooses different components for you. So that's variants. Variants is quite complex. There's a lot of stuff you can do with it. There are more properties you can do. You can add. And in the example we had before with like the cards in the App Store layout, you could make the text inside that property of the variant, so you could surface that too. But anyways, that's sort of getting us ahead of ourselves, and it's kind of like a advanced use case. But just know that like a variant is just a set of components that have shared properties, and so they were grouped together as a variant, essentially. That's all I have to say about variants. Sorry, this became very long, but I hope you feel like you have a hunch of what components, instances, and variants are all about.